Patel, and we're going to be going over period 7. Period 7 spans from 25 to 32 in PowerPoints, and I'll be covering PowerPoint 25 and 26. So if you're not going to listen to anything else, you at least want to listen to these main ideas for the PowerPoint 25 and the main ideas of PowerPoint 26. So we're going to start off by talking about 5 different things: Spanish-American War, the Panama Canal Zone, Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, dollar diplomacy, and moral diplomacy. So we're going to start off with Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War was an 1898 conflict between the United States and Spain that ended in Spanish colonial rule in the Americas and resulted in the U.S. acquisition of territories in the Western Pacific and Latin America. Basically, there was a lot of different riots and things going on in this area down in Latin America because of Spain occupying different places like Cuba and the Havana region. And after somehow the sinking of the USS Maine happened, we had to step in. The United States stepped in, and eventually, after a long drawn-out, it wasn't long drawn-out, but it was a pretty hefty war. The Spanish-American War ended when the Treaty of Paris was signed, and basically, Spain had to renounce all of its claim to Cuba, ceded Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States, and basically transferred sovereignty over to the Philippines. And this leads to the Panama Canal Zone, which basically the Spanish-American War illustrated that the U.S. military needed a canal to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans in order to protect the Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and Philippines that they just acquired. Basically, but they could do this, but there were a lot of implications with it, such as the Clayton-Bueller Treaty of 1850 or the Colombian Senate rejecting a treaty with the U.S. for the Panama Canal because they were kind of suspicious of the American power that was kind of growing with this. However, in 1914, the Panama Canal was completed. Now we're going to go on to the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Basically, we're going to start this off by talking about the Venezuela crisis in 1902. Germany had sank 2 different Venezuela gunboats trying to seek forced payments to Venezuela's debt. And in response, President Theodore Roosevelt devised a policy of preventive intervention that became known as the Roosevelt corollary. Basically, in this policy, in future financial crises concerning Latin American debt, the U.S. would intervene, take over, pay off debts, and keep European powers out of the thing. So basically, Roosevelt tied his policy to the Monroe Doctrine, and it was consistent with foreign policy of walk softly but carry a big stick. Roosevelt stated that in keeping the Monroe Doctrine, the United States was justified in exercising international police power to put end to chronic unrest and wrongdoing in that hemisphere, in the Western Hemisphere. So this was called the Roosevelt corollary. Okay, next we move on to dollar diplomacy. Dollar diplomacy under President William H. Taft. Basically, this was a foreign policy that protected Wall Street dollars investing across the world and other regions across the world, from the U.S. To places such as Asia. And they were basically, during this time, they were trying to take care of the financial chaos that's happening down. They were taking advantage of that happening down in like the Caribbean. And they were using this to help strengthen U.S. defenses and foreign policies while bringing prosperity to the U.S. And we're going to move on talking about moral diplomacy. During moral diplomacy, I'll give you an example. So basically, in Venezuela, there was a guy named Maduro that was president. Eventually, a person named Diaz take over. And then eventually, he was overthrown by an American Indian dude named Huerta. After that, the United States had to step in because what moral diplomacy is, it's basically we as a nation help support those countries that our beliefs are analogous to us. And because this guy the country was originally somewhat like ours, but then, this guy came in, take over. We helped them, get back to where they needed to be. All right, now we're going to talk about the Progressive Era. Progressive Era was just a widespread of social activism and political reform across the United States. It's kind of like a 3-step thing. This happened during 1896 through 1916, and this was kind of like a 3-step program where it was populism, then it was progressivism, and then it was kind of the New Deal. So we want to go down and talk about progressivism is an umbrella term, which basically a wide range of economic, political, social, moral reforms. This included efforts to outlaw sale of alcohol, regulate child labor, sweatshops, scientifically manage natural resources, ensure pure and wholesome food and water, Americanize immigrants to immigration altogether, and bust or regulate trusts. During support from urban, college-educated middle class, progressive reformers sought to eliminate corruption in the government, regulate business practices, address health hazards, improve working conditions. They also fought to give the public more direct control of the government through direct primaries to nominate candidates in public office, direct elections of senators in the initiative, a referendum and recall, and there was also women's suffrage. And that basically covers what you need to know for these two PowerPoints and the first fourth of this period.
World War I. Ignition of the powder keg. On June 1914, Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife. Austria-Hungary issued a warning to Serbia to let Austrian investigators examine the evidence. Serbia denied access to the evidence. This resulted in Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia. Austria-Hungary at the time was allied with Germany, while Serbia was allied with Russia. Both allies were drawn into the war, which resulted in dragging other allies into the war. Germany decided to take France out of the war early, running an offensive maneuver going through Belgium to directly access France. But the move proved fatal, as Britain was allied with the neutral country and came to its aid. Britain, seeing Germany encroaching on Belgian territory and Belgium being its ally, joined the war on the side of the Allies. The Central Powers included Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire, while the Allies included Britain, the United States, Russia, France, Italy, and Japan. Early in the war, America held a neutral stance, deciding not to join the conflict in Europe, but still sending supplies to the Allies, but not the Central Powers, as the British Navy held a blockade, preventing the Central Powers from trading with the United States. America originally suffered from the war at first, going into recession, causing the markets to close. Eventually, with negotiations with Britain and France, it allowed America's economy to recover. However, on May 7, 1915, German U-boats sunk the Lusitania, a British passenger ship, resulting in the death of 1,326 passengers, 128 passengers being American citizens. Germany claimed that they were munitions on board and refused to apologize, which enraged the American public. This event set America on a course to join the war. To add fuels to the flame, on March 1st, 1917, British intelligence intercepted a telegram from Germany to Mexico. The contents included a proposal of an alliance with Mexico, and if Germany won the war in Europe, Mexico would receive back the land that they had lost from the Mexican-American War. With more and more continuous attacks by German U-boats on passenger ships, as well as pressure from the American public, President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to join the war and is given the go-ahead. On April 6, 1917, the United States joined the war on the side of the Allies. After Germany's surrender, the leaders of the United States, Russia, Britain, and France met at Versailles. At Versailles, they wrote the Treaty of Versailles, which placed blames of war on Germany, ordered them to pay $31 billion over the course of 30 years, forced Germany to accept severe military restrictions, as well as loss of territory. This treaty also granted lands to new nations like Poland, Finland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. American society during the Roaring Twenties saw growth in the middle class, which saw increases in income 11% over the 20s, the standard of living increasing 8%. With the introduction of electricity, it became widely used in household appliances like refrigerator, which stored fresh foods. Entertainment became widespread with the creations of movies in black and white, which provided entertainment and news, creating stars and icons. Americans also passed time with sports like baseball, swimming, and boxing. With entertainment came jazz, a mix of Southern farm and gospel from New Orleans, which expressed African American culture. This new genre of song
Period 7.7 U.S. Isolation and the Road to World War II, and Period 7.8 America in World War II by Tanner Nelson. First, I will be speaking about Period 7.7 U.S. Isolation and the Road to World War II. America went into isolation after World War I. They left the League of Nations after refusing to sign the League Covenant and the Treaty of Versailles. This greatly weakened the League of Nations, and many blamed America for the start of World War II because of this. There was an arms race brewing between the US, Britain, and Japan, and the Washington Naval Conference was formed because of this. This conference addressed naval disarmament and the unstable political situation in the Far East. As a result of this conference, the Five Power Treaty was created in 1922. It established a 5-5-3 battleship ratio, with the US and Britain having 5 ships for every 3 Japanese ships. The US would not cancel its debts it was owed in reparations from Britain and France from World War I. This led France to conduct the Ruhr Crisis in 1923 in order to try to pay back the US in reparations. France sent troops into Germany's industrial Ruhr region when Germany could not pay its reparations it owed to France because of the World War I's Treaty of Versailles. Germany responded by allowing its currency to undergo hyperinflation, and by October of 1923, a loaf of bread cost around 120 million US dollars. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was signed and ratified by 62 countries in 1928. It declared war was illegal except for defensive purposes. However, the word defensive proved to be a major loophole, rendering the pact impotent. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, which violated the Nine-Power Treaty and the Kellogg-Briand Pact. America refused to recognize Japan's conquest by force, and Japan therefore left the League of Nations. Communism and fascism was brewing in Italy, Germany, and Russia. Because of this, FDR created the Good Neighbor Policy in 1933, which attempted to show non-intervention and cooperation in response to increased aggression in those areas. However, while America was dealing with the Great Depression in isolation, German aggression was on the rise. They invaded multiple countries, including the Czech and Poland, which enticed the beginning of World War II. The German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact was signed in 1939, which gave Germany the safety to attack Poland. Back then, this was unheard of communist and fascist getting along with each other and creating treaties and pacts with each other, since their ideas clashed often. However, because of this non-aggression pact, World War II began with the Axis and Allied powers clearly defined, and the US, however, being neutral for right now. Germany and the USSR continued to expand during this time. Germany took over 2/3 of France in June of 1940. However, there was a Battle of Britain in 1940, which Britain won, and the Allied forces used as a platform to attack Germany in later dates. Germany invaded Russia, but it was a failure of the harsh winter in 1941, which caused the USSR to switch sides and become an ally since Germany had violated their pact. The US stayed neutral in terms of direct fighting at this time, but instead aided the Allies with supplies using the Lend-Lease Act, which was ratified to allow America to give supplies to nations that FDR deemed vital to the defense of the US. Japan at this time thought war with the US was unavoidable, so they tried to invade the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and the Philippines to gain oil, metals, and other raw materials, which they did successfully, and potentially attack Pearl Harbor. The US found out about this and assumed they would attack those areas later in December, but not attack Pearl Harbor and America directly. However, America was fooled, and because of this, Period 7.8 went into action, and America was thrusted into World War II. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, killing 2,500 Americans and injuring 1,100 more. FDR claimed this is a date that will live in infamy as it declared war on Japan on the 8th of December. The US and Britain agreed to target Germany first since they agreed that they were the biggest threat. The US army grew from 2 million to 12 million by 1946. Germany and Italy declared war a few days later, on America on December 11th. This was a fatal blunder by Hitler, since Germany was not obligated to declare war against the US since it did not attack Japan first. However, this guaranteed that the US would focus most of its military might on Germany first and save Japan for later. The selective service registration was extended to men ages 18 through 65 after Pearl Harbor. The period of enlistment for each soldier was extended to 6 months after the war was over, and by war's end, over 16 million men and women had served in the military. Only 72,000 refused to enlist by claiming conscientious objection, largely for religious reasons, and only 5,500 refused to register and were jailed. Nearly 1 million African Americans served in segregated units such as the Tuskegee Airmen and 258,000 women enlisted as WACs, Women Army Corps, WAVES, Women Appointed for Voluntary Emergency Service, and WAFs, Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron. They provided medical aid and deciphered secret codes. Additionally, various societal gains were seen during World War II in Americans, such as the increase of female wages to more African American women working alongside white women as well. Successful anti-inflation administrations were implemented. Administrations such as the Office of Price Administration, the OPA, which froze prices and rents and allowed people to buy things such as cars and houses, are an example of administrations that were implemented. And it also allowed for money to cycle in the economy. These measures were successful because during World War I, the cost of living went up by 170%, while now it only went up by 29%. During this time, the Manhattan Project was secretly creating the atomic bomb. Early on, the Allied powers lost many Pacific battles, such as battles in the Philippines, which made it seem like the Allies may lose the World War II. The Japanese army also conducted the Bataan Death March. However, the Battle of Stalingrad and D-Day were the most crucial battles for the Allies. The turning point in the war in the Pacific area was the Battle of Midway against Japan. Japan also lost Okinawa and Iwo Jima. Later, Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945, which led to Nazi Germany surrendering unconditionally 7 days later to the Allied forces. However, at this time, Japan had no plans to surrender at this point. At the Potsdam Conference in 1945, 3 Allied leaders, Truman, Stalin, and Clement Attlee, warned Japan to surrender or suffer complete and utter destruction. However, Japan refused to remove its emperor, which shows signs in secret dispatches it may be willing to surrender if the emperor remained on the throne. Since Japan did not immediately surrender, 2 atomic bombs were dropped on them in 1945. One named Little Boy on Hiroshima and one named Fat Man on Nagasaki a few days later, when Japan did not surrender after the first Little Boy attack. Japan eventually surrendered after 150,000 deaths under the promise the emperor could stay in power as a figurehead. America occupied Japan for a few years and with that, World War II was over. After World War II, various conferences ensued, such as the Yalta Conference and the Casablanca Conference, in reference to the Allied power diplomacy. It is also found out that Hitler was conducting the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. Overall, over 50 million people were dead and over 35 million were wounded. 25 million civilians were also dead. Massive destruction of cities throughout Europe was seen, and after World War II, the USSR and the US went after each other because of the way they run their economies, communist versus capitalist. Germany was divided into 4 zones, as you can see on the right, between Britain, the USSR, America, and France. Lastly, synthetic materials such as plastics were developed to replace natural ones in short supply. Improvements in airplanes like radar changed the war forever. The A-bomb changed the course of human history, and the years after 1945 were called the Atomic Age.